Now, I sort of want to kick off because I've noticed on a lot of your feeds lately, and I can't help but shake the fact that this is becoming an increasingly prominent conversation, and this is about de-dollarization. Now,
Ah, yes.
I'm not interested in conspiracy theories, and this is why I've come to you on the matter. It, currencies are global, global reserve currencies have varied over the past 600 years. Since the 15th century, there's been a change in dominance of what is essentially the world's reserve currency. So the concept of moving away from the US dollar after a near 100-year reign isn't completely foreign. However, what I want to do is talk about why the implications with the reserve cut moving away from the US dollar are probably greater this time compared to other currency transitions that we have made in the past.
Yeah, look, for sure. It is a fascinating subject. It's one that's very difficult to steer clear of. And look, everybody's got an opinion on this, and the thing that kind of frustrates me about it is everybody is so dogmatic about it. And what you tend to get are two camps. One that says this is going to happen. The dollar's dead. It's finished. It's gone. It's just a matter of time now. And the other camp is it'll never happen. And like everything, I think the truth is in the middle somewhere. You mentioned talk about previous transitions from other reserve currencies. The pound probably before the US dollar. Going back to the Spanish peseta and the Portuguese escudo, believe it or not, both of which have completely vanished and been kind of subsumed by the euro. It happens. It's a fact of life, and what generally tends to happen is the country that has the reserve currency overextends itself, and ultimately the debts and the deficits cripple it, and it makes the currency unviable. The difference we have this time is the sheer amount of debt that's been built up over the years. And if you go back to the most recent kind of toppling of a reserve currency, which was sterling. After the war, obviously Bretton Woods came in. After World War II, Bretton Woods came in, and that was really the start of the dollar standard. But it wasn't until 1956 and the Suez Crisis when Britain was really dethroned, and that was really done by the Americans. The Britain needed loans from the Americans in order to finance an incursion into Egypt when they nationalized the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, sorry. And the Americans played hardball and basically had the Brits over a barrel, held them there, went to the United Nations, got a vote against them, and that was it. Britain was finished. The point being, there was a superpower actively working against the Brits to bring an end to that regime. And that's where we are today. We have the Chinese and the Russians actively working to bypass the US dollar. And if you look at the reasons they're trying to do that, they're absolutely valid, right? The US has a stranglehold on the global financial system through the dollar being the reserve currency and through the fact that every dollar trade has to go through the SWIFT system. And they've used that stranglehold as an offensive weapon a number of times in the last couple of decades, by excluding countries from SWIFT, which creates a massive problem for them because it stops them trading in dollars. And as many people watching this will know, and some may not, but it's definitely an important thing to understand, is that oil for the last 50, 60 years has been traded exclusively, for all intents and purposes, in dollars. And that's where the underpinnings of the strength of the US dollar comes from. Now we see a whole bunch of countries actively trying to find ways to transact oil in countries other than the US dollar. And yes, it's happening at the margin. And yes, it's not happening in huge size, but the yuan, the ruble, the rupee, the Turkish lira are all kind of countries being thrown in the mix, currencies being thrown in the mix to try and find ways that countries can trade in their native currency rather than have to go through the dollar. And the reason this has picked up, I think, picked up the pace is important to understand because it kind of stems from a couple of days after Putin went into Ukraine, when the US Treasury froze Russian central bank assets. When they did that, it basically forced every central bank in the world that holds dollar reserves to have to come up with a plan B and have to think through the potential of what happens if the US decides that we are a bad actor. And today it's crossing a border. Tomorrow, who knows? Maybe we decide not to join a coalition against Russia or a coalition against China, and we get labeled a bad guy. Would they do the same to us? Probably not, but it's not a risk you can take on a national level. So the pressures are coming against the dollar. They're happening every day. We've just seen the French sign a deal to trade natural gas outside the US dollar. So it's not just kind of fringe countries now. And so it's happening. There's no dispute that this is happening. The argument actually comes with A, does it matter? And B, when will it actually make a meaningful difference? And that's obviously unknowable. But the people that say it doesn't matter and it will never matter frustrate me enormously. And the people who say the dollar's dying and it's going to happen tomorrow frustrate me an equal amount. Somewhere in the middle, there is a process underway that is heading in a direction that's plain to see. And that direction ultimately is going to put an undue amount of strain on the dollar. And so one has to understand what's happening and pay attention and try and identify the points where that pressure on the dollar starts to increase, because that's when things get interesting.
One of the reasons the US dollar dominance exists is because it's one of the deepest and most liquid markets in the world, but it's also backed by the stable rule of law. Now, arguably, as a lot of the other countries that are looking to do deals or shift away from the US dollar, they don't have any of these three advantages to even underpin the stability of their currency. Look, this is wild speculation, I guess, that I'm throwing out there, but how do they create a viable currency system without having these three kings that have actually allowed the US dollar to achieve this dominance?
Well, it's a great question, Shay, and it's absolutely one of the right questions to ask. But if you think about the rule of law underpinning the US dollar, and then think about what they did with the Russian central bank assets, right? That's why that was such a crucial move, because that basically was done without any reference to law. And as we've seen through the bailouts over the last 15 years since 2008, laws in a crisis seem to get, certainly in the financial industry, seem to get run over roughshod. And if you can confiscate $600 million of a foreign country's financial assets with the stroke of a pen, I would argue that the rule of law is sacrosanct. And whether it's Russia crossing the border, if you have true rule of law, you wouldn't be able to do that just because they've done something that you decide is gives you the reason to do that. So that's the first point I would make, is that the rule of law in the West is not what it is, what it was. The rule of law is being changed. Contracts are being ripped up. There are all kinds of examples of that. The other side of that, obviously, is these other countries have to show a vast leap forward in those areas. And again, this is one of the areas where everybody is 100% dogmatic about this. China will never have a rule of law, and the West will never, ever let go of the rule of law. And, again, everybody needs to be a little bit more grey instead of being so black and white, and understand that, look what the French have done, right? The French have shoved through pension reform and upped the age of pensions, and have basically reneged on a promise they made to a whole bunch of people. They shoved that through without a vote. Macron put this through, and France is basically burning to the ground right now. People are so upset about it. The reality is this was something he had to do, because it's unworkable to have a country where 54% of the population work for the government, retiring everybody on full pensions at 62. It just doesn't work. And so if you look at what's happened in France, that is a signpost as to what happens in other countries when promises are reneged upon, which is another, a big part of what you need in terms of stability. The other big question that gets thrown about is the capital count in Russia, the closed capital count. And everybody says, well, there's no way they'll do that because, it just doesn't work for the Russians. They'll have too much capital flowing out of the country, and it'll cause problems for the yuan, all of which is true. However, that's not to say that changes won't happen. I agree how difficult it would be for those changes to take place. I agree with how unlikely they are to happen. But in this age of social media, there are so many people talking about using the word never. This will never happen. They will never do this. This will never change. The dollar will always be the reserve currency. And that to me springs from social media. Everyone takes a position, and instead of allowing themselves to be convinced that maybe they could be wrong, or maybe there is a slightly different potential outcome, everyone digs their heels in, because having made a statement publicly, they want to defend it and not be shown up in front of hundreds of thousands of people. So this dogmatism is one of the biggest enemies facing investors right now. You have to look at what's happening and every day one of these bilateral deals is being signed to trade energy in a different currency, or to open yuan swap lines, or reroute gas and energy flows to countries who are friendly with a certain regime. It's happening every day. You cannot deny it. So to watch all that take place, all of which is a big change in the status quo, and say, but it won't change the status quo, I just think is dangerous thinking. It doesn't mean bet the farm on the dollar going away. It doesn't mean bet the farm on the dollar, on the yuan being the reserve currency. But it means you shouldn't bet the farm on the status quo staying the same. And that is a big step for investors to take. And it means a lot of thinking, and it means potentially some big adjustments to your portfolio.